Celestial navigation, you must go back to ancient days. At that time, men thought the Earth was the center of the universe. To them, the celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars, all appeared to be moving overhead on the inside surface of a giant sphere. This imaginary sphere has an infinite radius and is concentric with the Earth. They gave this sphere a name, celestial sphere, and we still call it that today.
How the sky moves. Look up on a clear night and you'll notice that the sky looks like a vast dome with stars fixed to its inner surface. If the Earth were transparent, you'd see the stars on the other half of this starry sphere below your feet, and you'd get the impression that you were standing at the center of a velvety black sphere speckled with stars. Astronomers call this the celestial sphere.
This is said to be a depiction of the oldest globe map we know of today, made by Crates of Malus in the 2nd century BC. But here's another rather curious thing to consider. For a lot of us, when we hear mention of Atlas from Greek mythology, we picture this muscular Titan figure holding up a globe. But of course, in the actual mythology of Atlas, he's said to be holding up the sky, not the Earth. So how did this picture of Atlas holding up the globe Earth come about? Well, when we look at this Farnese Atlas statue, we see him holding up a globe, but it's actually not the Earth. It's the celestial sphere, covered not with continents, but with the constellations. The Farnese Atlas is from the 2nd century AD, but it is said to be a replica of a much older version from earlier Hellenistic times. So what I really want to know is which really came first, the terrestrial globe or the celestial globe? The globe by Crates is curious. I mean, even if the ancient Greeks believed that the Earth was a globe, they weren't really making globe maps yet. Not from the ground, anyways. They hardly left the Mediterranean. I mean, yes, they went to England and North Africa, and we have all these variations of what's known as the OT map with the 3 main continents of Europe, Asia, and North Africa, and there was the Spice Road that went to Asia, and they had maps, but they had maps of kind of the main central continent there. But it wasn't until guys like Columbus and Vasco da Gama and Magellan and Captain Cook went out there and started sailing the oceans that any real attempt at mapping the whole Earth from the surface of it could even be attempted. But of course we all know that they were using celestial navigation to chart their way, even if they didn't know what lay ahead on the horizon in terms of, waterways or land masses. They already had sort of a full globe map because they had the celestial globe map, which had been around since antiquity due to the fact that the heavens move and you can chart a good deal of the stars without having to travel over much of the Earth's surface. But then, in this last couple of years, suddenly all these people around the world start questioning all of it, start doubting NASA, and then trying to actually measure curvature and not finding it. Everybody starts scratching their heads trying to understand just what the heck is going on and how does it all work, what's the real map, what's the real model, how do the heavens work, so on. And we know all the sticking points that are debated endlessly about the southern stars and the equinoxes, and we've seen all these kinds of theories and heard all kinds of alleged debunkings and etc. But overall, there's still a lot of unanswered specific questions when we definitely don't have it all figured out. But I have to say that I do think we are in many ways really making progress in narrowing some very important things down. And we've begun to realize that things like perspective would of course have an effect on things like viewing the sun, moon, and stars. I've just been looking at P-Brain's video on crepuscular and anti-crepuscular rays regarding the southern stars, and it really is something that makes you stop and think. It still leaves me with some questions, but I definitely think he's onto something there. And then of course Skiba just put out his video on atmospheric lensing, and ODD mirrored that because it was just so great. And he's demonstrating how this lensing effect from water, which of course the atmosphere has lots of, would of course factor into all these anomalous, things that we've been debating over for so many months. Things like building being cut off over the horizon. And is that due to curvature or refraction or, what? And it's pretty amazing to see what he was able to demonstrate with just a very simple experiment, and even with the sun. And I would think that would have to factor into our view of the stars as well, things like atmospheric lensing. And speaking of the stars, there's all the things we've been realizing as we look closer with P900 lenses and everything, seeing that stars and planets are very different from what we've long assumed, and they seem to be more along the lines of like what Bob from Globebusters describes as sonoluminescent electromagnetic manifestations. I love that term, by the way, Bob. And yeah, it would seem that, so another net conclusion we've been realizing is that somehow the higher up you go into the atmosphere, at some point the stars begin to actually vanish from view. And so they are, for lack of a better word, somewhat holographic. And so it would seem that somehow you can't simply fly up into the enclosure of the firmament and get a close-up look at one. They just disappear. So really the combined picture that all these factors would seem to be presenting to us is that somehow all of these little elements work together to create this domed appearance of the heavens. And it's actually kind of funny because when you start watching a lot of these instructional videos on the celestial sphere as used by astronomy and navigation and everything, you hear over and over again them talking about how when you go outside and look up, it appears like the stars are on a dome, and this is what the ancients saw, etc. So this is the crazy little question here. This is where I have to stop and wonder if this isn't the point where so much of the illusion is just all stemming from. Because, of course, those who laugh at the idea of the flat Earth and point to astronomical knowledge as clear evidence for the globe, they'll instantly say that as you move around the Earth, you're able to see space from every angle. A hemisphere of the celestial globe is said to simply be what you can see from any given spot on the Earth because that's your field of vision, and the other half was being blocked by the globe. But what is beginning to emerge is that this, quote, dome overhead is really just more a function of our visual faculties as we move across the plane. And it's created by a combination of factors such as perspective, atmospheric lensing, and perhaps the even yet to be understood hyperdimensional qualities of the luminaries themselves. So to me, it seems pretty likely that this is a very key point in the entire debate over cosmology. And so much hinges upon this question of whether to just accept the assumption that the celestial hemisphere that one can see at any given time is a result of a person standing on a globe, looking out at roughly half of a vast infinite space, or if indeed perhaps that celestial hemisphere, quote unquote, is really just something that is more a function of the way we see the sky as we move across the flat Earth. Speaking of statues of Atlas, most people are far more familiar with the one that stands in front of the Rockefeller Center in New York. And once again, when you look at it, it's easy to assume that the globe structure that he's holding is a representation of the globe Earth. But if you look closer, you recognize there's symbols on there that are of the planets, and probably the zodiac as well. So again, it's the celestial sphere, not the terrestrial. And of course, if you're aware of just how much ancient occult knowledge is connected to folks like the Rockefellers and all the other statues and imagery they've got put up at that property and elsewhere, then, this again is something else that really makes you stop and think. Most people are also familiar with how many places in megalithic structures on Earth, such as the Giza pyramids, are built in correspondence to specific stars or constellations. This has everything to do with the celestial sphere idea, and the idea that it's broken up into a grid pattern with its own meridian and equator, and this whole system is how sailors navigated their ways on the seas for hundreds of years. And not surprisingly, many of the pioneers in astronomy, such as Bessel, who is credited with supposedly succeeding in finally measuring the stellar parallax, he started out as a sailor and an expert in celestial navigation. So my point is that so there's that correspondence, but they could map the sky much easier than mapping the Earth because, like I said, the sky moves, whereas to map the Earth from the surface, you have to walk all over it with a sight and compass and, use basic surveying techniques. It's a lot of work. But that's not how the first terrestrial globe maps were made. They didn't hike all over every stretch of dirt and measure it from the ground. I mean, especially when the explorers started going out across the oceans, not knowing exactly where the land even was, but they knew where they were in reference to the stars. And when they started mapping the lands that they found, such as individual islands out in the middle of the ocean, there was no other reference point to be able to find their way back there other than the stars. And that's how they did it, using the celestial sphere as the map. But just because the stars can be used so reliably in navigation, does that itself mean the celestial sphere must indeed be a full globular map of stars that envelops a globe Earth? I don't believe that's the case at all. And of course, from a biblical point of view, we are told that God made the stars to mark the times and seasons. And also in regard to the birth of Christ, we see God himself employing the stars as a navigational aid. So I think it's pretty clear that they were created for our benefit as both a calendar system and a navigational system built right into the ceiling of the creation itself. And so finally, when we get into questions about maps, we spend a lot of time talking about projections, usually all the various types of flat map projections from the alleged truly spherical Earth. But overall, when you put all this together, what it would seem to indicate is that really the terrestrial globe model is basically itself a projection, a false projection based on the false assumption of a celestial sphere, the celestial globe. And I hate to bring up the same old Gnostic occult connections to things once again, but really what it would mean is that the globe model, the globe grid as a whole, is a giant geometric construct of the old esoteric phrase, as above, so below.
This imaginary sphere has an infinite radius and is concentric with the Earth. They gave this sphere a name, celestial sphere, and we still call it that today. Theory of celestial navigation, you must go back to ancient days. At that time, men thought the Earth was the center of the universe. To them, the celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars, all appeared to be moving overhead on the inside surface of a giant sphere.
Rather curious thing to consider. For a lot of us, when we hear mention of Atlas from Greek mythology, we picture this muscular Titan figure holding up a globe. But, of course, in the actual mythology of Atlas, he's said to be holding up the sky, not the Earth. So, how did this picture of Atlas...
A velvety black sphere speckled with stars. Astronomers call this the celestial sphere.
This is said to be a depiction of the oldest globe map we know of today, made by Crates of Malus in the 2nd century BC. But here's another...
How the sky moves. Look up on a clear night and you'll notice that the sky looks like a vast dome with stars fixed to its inner surface. If the Earth were transparent, you'd see the stars on the other half of this starry sphere below your feet, and you'd get the impression that you were standing at the center of